Good afternoon, my name is Matt Treacy and I'd like to introduce you to our guest this afternoon, who's an extremely prolific author, Joseph Pearce, who's originally from London but is now based in the United States in the Deep South. He's currently in South Carolina. And Joseph was born in London in 1961. He's had a very interesting life. He was a member of the National Front, which was then a neo-Nazi racist organisation. He spent 2 terms in prison under the Incitement to Hatred Act. And during that time, he gradually came to see some benefit or some light through grace, he would say, through the writings of Hilaire Belloc, whose the anniversary of whose death is actually today, and C.K Chesterton and others. And this eventually led to his conversion to Roman Catholicism. He's the author of, from my perspective, as an aspirant author, an enviable list of books, which include biographies of C.K Chesterton and Belloc, as well as a very interesting biography of Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, who Joseph met in Russia in 1998, I think. He's also written about Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, Shakespeare, and other Catholic authors. So he's an extremely interesting curriculum vitae, you might say. Also under the influence of Belloc and Chesterton, and also laterally through Joseph Schumacher, who wrote Small is Beautiful in the late 1970s, which makes an interesting connection to traditional Irish nationalist ideology, if you like, because there used to be a philosophy called Cor na Corson, which in English means the cooperation of neighbours, which is basically a distributivist outlook on life, which was also influenced by Catholic social teaching. So I might ask Joseph about that later on too. But first of all, I'd like to ask him, I've just finished his extremely interesting autobiography called Race with the Devil, which details Joseph's life from a young child in London. He moved to Suffolk, and his dealings with the National Front. He had connections with loyalists in Ulster along the way, his conversion and his move into being a full-time writer. And one of the things that actually struck me, Joseph, and it kind of resonates in my own family, is your references to your father and the fact that he introduced you to Shakespeare, because as I think Theodore Dalrymple said recently, and this resonated with me in relation to being from a working class Dublin background, that it's very rare to find that kind of literary, autodidactic, if you like, background among working class people from backgrounds such as we came from. So I'd just like to start by asking you, how much of an influence was your father and his introduction to you of Shakespeare and English poetry?
Well, first of all, you're correct. I'm obviously from a working class background. It's not that usual or common to have parents who are deeply imbued with a knowledge of literature or with history or with foreign languages. My father left school at the age of 14 during World War II, and that was when his official education ended. So he was an autodidact. He taught himself. Just because of a love of knowledge and a desire to just broaden his vision of things. And so that sense of teaching yourself and not relying on institutional educational mechanisms, I think I inherited from him. So first of all, just to be raised, if you like, at my father's knee on the brilliance and beauty of Shakespearean English was a blessing, even though, of course, as a child, I didn't realize that. It's something I've come to realize from a perspective of maturity. But just to have someone that's, that knew about history and geography and imbued that enthusiasm for knowledge within the home. It was unusual for a working class lad, a working class family. But I feel very, very blessed to have had a father that bestowed that upon me.
Mm. Yeah, as well, I'd say from a similar background, in some way, the people that we would have been friendly with, myself and my brothers, they would be completely bewildered when they came into our house. My father and mother had left school when they were 12 or 13 in the 1940s, but they'd come from families where books were talked about and were very precious, and would have been a small enough kind of library they had, but friends would come into the house and they'd see like the bookshelf behind you, and they'd be amazed because they'd no association with books outside of school, which kind of leads me on the way. It's really interesting from my perspective as somebody from a Republican background and having been a prisoner myself at one stage. What impression did they make on you? Again, from that kind of perspective, did they have a kind of an intellectual background, or is it just what we would see on the screens, bonfires and marching bands?
That's a great question, and I'm going to have to think on my feet, because basically my involvement with the loyalist extremists was a consequence of a tribalist reactionism, a knee-jerk reaction. So my father, I mean, another thing I make clear in my biography, that a large part of my conversion is, yes, taking with me the good things I learned from my father, but also having to unlearn some of the bad things I got from him. And so, for instance, I did also learn racism at my father's knee. And I also, part of that racism, if you like, was an anti-Catholicism. So to maybe contextualize it, my father grew up in the East End of London in the 1930s and 40s and early 50s as a child, youth and young man. And certainly as a young man, he'd be in the pub, and there was a big Ford plant, car production plant. And there were a lot of Irish people obviously moving to England at that time. And, they'd be in the pubs, probably very happily together. And then at some point, someone would break out in a Fenian song. And all of a sudden, the English and the Irish would be brawling in the pub. And my dad has the scars to show. He's passed on now, God rest his soul. But so he grew up with this sort of, and it's a love-hate thing, because he was also a carpenter. So he worked in the building industry. So many of his best friends were Irish, and he drank with them all the time. So it was a really weird thing. And then, of course, when the trouble started, I was only 8. And then obviously the bombs started going off. And I obviously the fact that I got involved as a neo-Nazi meant I was an angry young man. So my attitude was that, an eye for an eye. It's not a Christian. And if the IRA are going to plant bombs, then I support anybody who's going to kill the IRA. It was as simple as that. So my involvement with the loyalists, I joined the Orange Order. I started listening to loyalist records, first of all, the Culture, UDA records, UVF records, Glasgow Rangers records. So when I first went to Northern Ireland in October 1978 and was involved in a riot in Derry, it was very much a tribal thing. So I wasn't looking for intellectual engagement at the time. And I don't really recall that my involvement with the loyalist paramilitaries was on any cerebral level. It was on a level of allegiance. In the case of the UVF, a somewhat cynical level of trying to get me and my comrades to be part of a gun running operation, which, thanks be to God, I was not interested in cooperating with. So I don't think that my engagement with loyalism was ever particularly on an intellectual level. I don't want to say as a consequence of that, of course, that there were no intellectual loyalists, because I'm sure that's not the case. But that wasn't my engagement. That I was purely tribal. I saw it as a war, and I saw myself as fighting on one side of that war.
When I was in Portlaoise, obviously there were no loyalist prisoners there, but I did meet a number of them. One of them was studying in Trinity College at the same time as me, and I used to go for I didn't get to know him that well. I can't even remember his surname now, but we'd go for a couple of pints the odd time. I did come to understand, like, he was obviously pretty intelligent, the fact that he was in university at all, and he did quite well afterwards. But I did come to understand that the world from their perspective, and how, like, there was people on our side got involved in all sorts of terrible, inexcusable things as well. And which reminds me, to ask you about, you mentioned one chap who you met outside, I think, a UVF club, and then you later found out he murdered the mother of an IRA prisoner or something. Did you ever hear what happened to that chap afterwards?
I didn't, because it was about a year later, and I'm not even sure that even at the time that I knew his name. In other words, because he was the leader of a UVF cell, an active service unit, whatever the terminology was at the time, and no names were given. They just approached us in a UVF club in Rathcoole, just to the north of Belfast, and wanted basically he was disillusioned with the UVF leadership and wanted to basically become if you like, the paramilitary wing of the National Front, and wanted to put himself under my direct command, which just scared me, quite frankly. I thanks be to God, I never wanted to be at least directly responsible for killing anybody else. Indirectly, I'm sure that I contributed towards people being hurt at least, but. So I never knew his name. I was told by my own contacts in Northern Ireland that he was arrested for shooting dead. I think it wasn't even. I think he shot dead the mother or something. It wasn't even, if my memory serves me correctly, it wasn't even the IRA man. It was a botched mission for which he was arrested. But I don't think I ever knew his name. I just heard that from one of my connections in Northern Ireland. As you were involved. The need to know principle is crucial. If you don't need to know, you don't ask, because the more you know, the more you're compromised. So it's better to remain ignorant if you don't need to know.
There's also an element related to that, from your own book, that when I started out, the loyalist chap was kind of like there, but for the grace of God. Like, I don't think that he had ever been involved in anything particularly horrendous, neither was I, thankfully. But even though we were poles apart, and similar to what you were saying, I would consider myself a Marxist at the time. So it was like you surrendered, you'd given up your personal autonomy to be part of something, even then when you knew things that were being done in your name, that you were collectively responsible for, that you excused them by saying, oh, well, it might be bad now, but in the end, it's going to lead to whatever your particular objective was. What was the real point that you came to that realization where you said that, it's, from my point of view, it was a process of kind of taking personal responsibility. So I've done whatever, but I'm here and it's up to me now to get myself out. What was the key?
Yeah, another great question. One of the tragedies and one of the dangers of ideology is that you are correct. We subsume our personality to the good of the cause. We start believing in systemic things rather than in personal responsibility and in the love of neighbor. So that was certainly me. And I think that, there was what I call an intellectual arm wrestle going on in my head and my heart, because I had all of this racist ideology that I'd really grown up with. I joined the National Front when I was 15, and all I read for several years was basically ideological stuff associated with it. But then I started reading people like C.K Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc and Schumacher that you mentioned. And I first of all, I wasn't interested in the religious aspects, just merely the distributism that you mentioned. But then I came to realize that their distributism was a consequence of Catholic social teaching, and therefore you couldn't separate their religion from their political beliefs. So this caused a confusion at first, but I couldn't help liking the people, these Catholic writers that I'd sort of fallen in love with in some way, nor the ideas that they espoused. And so, the logical progression was to move towards religious conversion. And so at some point you realize that, yes, you are personally responsible, that you have been living a life of sinfulness and destructiveness, not just to others, but to yourself. And for me, I've been involved in the politics for so long, I really had virtually no friends and no acquaintances outside the movement. In the movement, I was a hero. Outside the movement, because the prison sentences made national headlines, I was a pariah. So, I stayed actually inside, largely as an act of cowardice, probably longer than I should have done, because inside it was warm and cozy, and I was a hero. Outside was cold and scary, and I was a villain. But in the end, I had to cross that threshold, and it meant leaving London, leaving all of my network of friends, moving to a relative backwater into Norfolk, and starting a fresh life there. And a year or so after that is when I was received into the church. So at some point, you know that you've got to escape from the systemic nightmare in which you found yourself into the freedom of personal responsibility, even though that's going to require a messy, not very pleasant period of transition.
I would have been reading Solzhenitsyn in 1989, 1990, when the whole social system was collapsing. I was starting to think, this is actually not a good idea. And I'd actually been in Eastern Europe in 1988, 1989. It was just a mess, appalling system. And I was from a Catholic family, obviously, but I wasn't particularly religious. And it was only through reading Solzhenitsyn and other people that I realised that this is actually, an alternative to. It's not a scheme that solves every problem in the world. It's a way of looking at the world. It's a way of looking at yourself that replaces this. Can be a psychopathic dependency and affiliation with, collectivism or race or whatever. And I'm kind of jealous of the fact that you actually met Solzhenitsyn. What sort of person was he as a?
Well, I mean, first of all, before I answer that, if you don't mind, I think, as you mentioned Solzhenitsyn, you brought Solzhenitsyn up and about this personal responsibility. One of the key ideas of Solzhenitsyn is that the battle between good and evil takes place in each individual human heart. In other words, there's a civil war going on in every individual person, and we have to win that civil war before we can actually be on the right side in anything larger. So that's a crucial idea of Solzhenitsyn's, which was transformative to me. As for Solzhenitsyn himself, first of all, I was astonished that he agreed to meet me, because he'd been treated so poorly by Western media that he'd effectively washed his hands of them and shaken the dust from his sandals and walked off and refused to be interviewed by anybody. So when I wrote to him, I wasn't expecting to receive a reply, and I certainly wasn't expecting to receive a positive reply. But he put me in touch with two of his sons who speak fluent English, and I went to Moscow. And so I had this image of Solzhenitsyn, which I think most people have, of him being a sort of rather stern, humorless, sort of like a prophet who's too serious for his own good. Sometimes I think of G.K. Chesterton's wonderful saying. He said, "Angels can fly because they take themselves lightly, whereas the devil falls by the force of his own gravity." In other words, taking oneself too seriously is not necessarily healthy. But what I discovered when I got there is that he was a man full of humor. He had china blue, very, very attractive china blue eyes. And although he was 79 when I met him, his eyes were very youthful. And at one point I held his gaze, and on the surface was this sort of almost jolly, jocular youthfulness, but you held the gaze, and it seemed to be depths of suffering and experience. Now, of course, I don't know to what extent that was my subjective projection onto the moment, or whether it was really there objectively. But either way, it was a very moving moment for me. But he had a chuckle, he had an infectious chuckle. He was full of joy and humor. His son told me that he has a great power to mimic. And he can mimic politicians and have the whole family rolling on the floor with laughter. And what astonished me about him is this was a man who was very, very full of joy, full of happiness. I think he was very, 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 very joyful at returning home. And again, one thing that's amazing about Solzhenitsyn, in the 1970s, when the Cold War seemed to be a permanent thing, when it seemed to be stable, right? You got the Eastern Bloc and you got the NATO countries, and they're sort of button heads, but it's stable. He said he was convinced that he would return home to Russia before he died. And the fact that he was proved right, he went back in 1994, so 4 years before I met him. He started writing poetry again upon his return home. So I think that this joy at actually being able to go back to Russia was part of it, but absolutely was the depth of his Christian faith, his Orthodox faith. And there's no doubt that imbued in him a sense of joy, and that overspilled with humor and this infectious chuckle. So the Solzhenitsyn I met in 1998 is not the stereotypical figure of him that we see in the media.
So it was his faith that made him able to endure the horrors that he went through.
Yeah, exactly. In my biography of Solzhenitsyn, I have a chapter with a sort of rather bad pun as the title, and it's called Arrested Development. Because for Solzhenitsyn, the major developments in his life that led him in the right direction, which is ultimately towards God, required great suffering. So until his arrest, he was arrested during World War II for writing in a private letter to a friend, contained just one sentence that was relatively mildly critical of Joseph Stalin. Now, there were no private letters in the Soviet Union. Everything was open and read. And for that, private criticism of Stalin in personal correspondence, he was sentenced to 7 years in prison. And he was arrested, treated very abysmally, ended up in a labor camp. But he considered that to be a great blessing, because prior to that, he was an atheist. He believed in the Marxist lie. And the only way he could be shaken out of that nightmare, which he thought was a dream, was a healthy dose of reality. And the being arrested was that healthy dose of reality. So he actually called, he says, thank you, prison. You're a blessing.
Actually, I became fascinated by the Gulag, and I read memoirs by other Russians and Poles, and Tales of the Columnia, or Shamalov, I think, Shalamov. I think the difference between that book and between Solzhenitsyn is that Tales of the Columnia, it's just unremitting horror with it's just bleak. He survived the camps for a while after, whereas in Solzhenitsyn, Shalamov was kind of saying, this is really how bad humans can be to one another, and we're lucky if we can escape and go off and die quietly. Whereas Solzhenitsyn said, no, this shows you the horrors that our humans are capable of doing unless they have some higher meaning. And I remember arguing with people over this, and they'd still say, they kind of make it, laughing about, oh yeah, millions of people died. It's because it was supposed to be in the pursuit of some higher purpose. And then when people started to move to Ireland from Eastern Europe, and you'd meet with people from Latvia or Estonia or Czechoslovakia or Poland, and you'd hear the reminiscences they had of their own parents. I remember talking to one Latvian woman who I used to work with. 3 of her grandparents, one of them had been murdered, presumably by the Nazis, and 2 of them had been taken to the camps in the East. And she said, look, I remember one person trying to argue with her one day saying, oh yeah, but socialism is better than Nazism. And she said, it's not.
Well, I think it's a false dichotomy. It's national socialism and international socialism. They're both socialist regimes. And they both believe in big government. They both believe in treading dissidents, the head of dissidents under jackboots. To all intents and purposes, it makes no difference with respect to, first of all, the Christian faith and to the practice of religious liberty, whether the jackboots on the left foot or on the right foot, quite frankly.
Mm. And just in the context of the world we're living in at the moment, just kind of some aspects of what's happening now would remind you of the Turkeys. You had people who were probably nice people. I think Belloc actually got on well with him, George Bernard Shaw. But he was a man who managed to apologise for Hitler and Stalin. He probably was a nice chap. He probably never did anything evil personally in his life, but he made apologies for all these monsters. And you can see people now, what's wrong with woke culture? What's wrong with, political correctness? It's because it's leading to exactly the same sort of world. And so you are not going to be the person who's going to be sending me or other people to labour camps, but people who can't wait for that to happen.
I'm not. Solzhenitsyn actually called himself a pessimistic optimist, and that sounds like a contradiction, but it means that. But J.R.R. Tolkien said that as a Christian, I see history as the long defeat with only occasional glimpses of final victory. So the point is to see history as a Christian sees it. We have to see it in 2 senses. We have to see it from the perspective of the time in which we find ourselves. but also from the perspective of eternity. And we have to understand that God is both omniscient, in other words, all-knowing, but also omnipresent. And when we talk about God's omnipresence, we think that God's present everywhere, right? He's under the table, he's on the roof, etc. But in a deeper sense, it means everything is present to God. In other words, there's no future and there's no past to God. The whole of history is present to him. So Shakespeare is as present to him as in time. All of time is as present to him in his omnipresence. So if you see things in that sense, you understand that all of us are on active service in the church militant. In other words, the church at war with the forces of secularism, the forces ultimately of godlessness. And we have to serve our time as if you like, soldiers until we die. And, 70 years and 10, for some of us might be a bit longer, for many of us it's much shorter. And so we don't have to be worrying about what's going to be happening 20 or 30 years from now, because it's all happening in God's presence. And so that's the first thing. So that's the first thing I want to say, because that's the most important. But within the context of time and our own myopic understanding of things, because we are trapped in time, we are making the same mistakes. Chesterton said that modern man is like a supercilious cad who contemptuously kicks down the ladder by which he's climbed. In other words, there's collective amnesia, and that every age, every generation thinks it knows better than the previous one, which means it feels it has no lessons to learn from the past. Consequently, we're ignorant of Nazi Germany, we're ignorant of Stalinist Russia, we're ignorant of Mao Zedong's China, and in consequence, we're now going blindly towards new forms of Marxism, seeing human existence in terms of political systems and not in terms of human persons. And when you start seeing the politics in terms of systems and not persons, that's when you get systemic persecution, systemic killing of dissidents, and history repeats itself tragically. And that's the path that we appear to be careering down at the moment.
But that's the thing, isn't it? Once you start looking at humans as means to an end rather than ends in themselves, you've already created a moral basis for using people for whatever you want to achieve. And that's to me, it's coming from I'm never quite an atheist, but from a lapsed Catholic background, the way I gradually came to see the importance of religion again, not just Catholicism or Christianity, but world religions in general, is that they all hold a central core value of individuals, which is why the Chinese tried to destroy Buddhism, that's why they're attacking the Uyghur Muslims at the moment. They just can't tolerate any kind of worldview that's not controllable by the party. But in relation to, I was asked said before about pessimism, in this country, as you probably know, the abortion referendum was passed three or 4 years ago. And it's unlikely to be overturned in the immediate, but you come to a realisation that that's significant, obviously, in the kind of horrors it's given rise to, but it's also important that despite the political defeat, that people who were right about that are still on the right side. And it's like what Whittaker Chambers said when he gave the information about the Communist Party infiltration of the State Department in the United States. He said he felt like he was leaving the winning side to join the losing side, but he knew that he was going to the right side rather than spending the rest of his life in a lie. I've seen some of your podcasts where you've spoken about the way in which Catholicism in England was basically suppressed in the 16th century. Do you think that kind of spirit has survived? That is that still a central core of English culture?
Well, I think actually, and ironically, I mean, my next book, which will be coming out in November, is the title I've given it. So if the publisher doesn't change the title, is Faith of Our Fathers, History of True England, which is a history of England that remained true to the faith. Because England was, of course, Catholicism arrived in England in 63 AD, so within 30 years of the crucifixion, with the arrival of the Romans, and remained here in Celtic Christianity, and then obviously the Anglo-Saxons converted, and so England was a Catholic country for 1,500 years before Henry VIII basically declared war on the Church, and then we have 300 years of heroic resistance by the recusants in England. First 150 years of which there were executions, because it was punishment by death to be a priest. It was punishment by death to hide a priest. So for me, this is the true England. This is the England to which I owe allegiance. And that's why I do have certainly a sense of camaraderie with the persecuted Irish, who also suffered greatly for their faith. But it was actually, ironically, the Catholic restoration, the Catholic revival in England coincided with two things: that the conversion of highbrow intellectuals such as St. John Henry Newman in 1845, but I don't think it was any coincidence. I think it was providential that 1845 also coincides with the Irish potato famine, and that led to the Irish diaspora, obviously to America, Australia, and other places. But many Irish people came to England. So almost overnight, you have this sort of the higher echelons of society, including lots of converts, very intellectually minded converts. And then you have the working class Catholics coming in. So it's almost like a pincer movement provided by God for Catholic revival. And one thing we always need to remember is that after 300 years of darkness for the faith in England, that Chesterton said that the Catholic Church has died many times. It's been destroyed many times in its history, but it always rises from the dead because it worships a God who knew the way out of the grave. So that's what we always, when things seem to be going badly in this vale of tears, and it is a vale of tears, that we have to understand that ultimately we are on the winning side.
Yes, when the time you spent in prison, was there any particular? I know you talk in the book about the time with the rosary beads. So I found myself and with other people that the fact that you're kind of confronted with the reality that you're there and either make excuses for it, say, oh, it's somebody else's fault, or rather than, I don't know if you've been familiar with Theodore Dalrymple.
Yes. I met him actually about the December before last, the December before COVID. We were both speaking at a conference in Budapest in Hungary, actually. So that's I'd known about him for years, but that's the first and thus far only time we met.
But again, kind of like the contrast between Solzhenitsyn and the Tales of the Colmia, that Dalrymple, he's very funny, describing horrible things, but he's funny the way he describes them. But as far as I know, he considers himself to be an atheist. I think that he doesn't like. It's a searing look at how society is at the moment, not just in Britain, but parts of Dublin are exactly the same. That he doesn't seem to hold any hope for that to be turned around, which I think is kind of sad. Whereas it might be at a very basic level that you can address these things, but you have to, or otherwise you just surrender.
Well, I think the key thing is that we don't have to defeat the culture of death, because the culture of death is self-defeating. In other words, that it's suicidal, and it's his own worst enemy. And there's an Irish saying, actually, at least I think it's an Irish saying, that he who bites the rock of Peter breaks his teeth. Now, whether or not that's true, what is certainly true, he who bites the rock of reality breaks his teeth. And ideologies based upon a false anthropology, a false understanding of who we are, always fail. The French Revolution failed. The Soviet experiment failed. The Nazi experiment failed. Often violently, often horribly. I mean, there's going to be lots of innocent victims, but we don't have to destroy the culture of death because it's destroying itself. All we have to do is to be true to the truth, which is in Jesus Christ. And if that means we have to return to the catacombs, and times of persecution. I mean, the Irish have a history of being persecuted. They were indomitable, and ultimately they've sold themselves from a perspective of comfort, not from a perspective of persecution. So if we have to have another period where we have to return to the catacombs, then so be it, because we do worship a God that knows way out of the grave. The culture of death will destroy itself, and we will emerge from the ashes.
And as part of that regeneration, if you like, how important would you see distributivism as being? Would you regard it as a viable economic alternative?
It's the only viable economic alternative to globalism. If we put all our eggs into the globalist basket, when that basket is dropped because it becomes unsustainable, we all starve to death. The extent to which we have viable local economies, where at least the basic necessities of life are being produced, and most importantly, agriculture, food. The more that we have that, the healthier the society will be. Basically, a society where people have real control over their economic destiny is a free society. A society where we're all employed by global corporations, where we have no democratic rights within the institution for which we work, where we have no power over our own labor, is a perspective of slavery. So distributism is not only ethically necessary in terms of economic sustainability and life, the sustainability of life, it's also necessary.
I think it probably does need to be just at that basic level, doesn't it? I mean, it took me for a while to realise that rather than trying to fight some orangutan opponent, that if you're serious about addressing any issue, whether it's a moral issue or an economic issue or a social issue, you have to start with yourself, where you buy. So what
you have to start where you are. It begins with you, and it begins with where you are. You can't take on the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. But what you can do is you can make the area in which you live much healthier through localism, through helping, having a local culture, local economies, and either start producing things yourself locally, but at least patronize those that are. I mean, just practical examples. We believe that we should be spending a higher portion of our income, let's speak about my family now, on food. So we're not interested in having the latest gadgets. In fact, we're techno-minimalists. We have the fewest gadgets we can get away with. But certainly we're not going to buy the newest version when it comes out. We're quite happy to have the older version. So we don't spend a lot of money on high-tech stuff. We spend a lot of money on food, which means we buy all of our meat and all of our vegetables from local farmers. So we are part of a sustainable economic network, which is ensuring we have a local economy here, which is not only healthy in itself, but is actually independent from the globalist institutions.
That's something similar to Wendell Berry.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, he's actually cut himself off, hasn't he, from phones and internet.
Yeah, and I actually, funny enough, and again, providentially, coincidentally, I came back yesterday from a conference in Kentucky, and several of the people I was talking to there, because he's from Kentucky, several of them know him. One was his former secretary, so I heard anecdotes about him. So yeah, he's a great hero. He is for me. Someone who practices what he preaches and writes very inspiringly about it. And there are generations now, because he's an old man, that have been inspired by his example and by his writings, both his non-fiction and his fiction, towards should we say, a local and a sane alternative to the madness in which we find ourselves.
I think that was one of the things that the liberal left in the West couldn't handle about Solzhenitsyn. They're expecting him to come say, okay, the Soviet Union's bad and we should all go to McDonald's and buy Coca-Cola and T-shirts and Levi's. He said, no. You're going exactly the same way, except you're going by a different route. And so one of the insidious things I think about this, the COVID restrictions is that you see small businesses all across the world, small food producers, small groceries, pubs in Ireland are obviously a big thing, that lots of them are not going to survive. And the people who were supposed to be in favour of, the left socialists, they're supporting all this. And it's through some kind of weird ideological prism. They think, oh, we get rid of all, like Lenin, get rid of all the small farmers, get rid of all the small capitalists, because then we'll deal with the Microsofts and the IBMs, which of course they won't, because they're paying their
It's
wage.
naive. I wrote something fairly recently called Antifa, the Stormtroopers of Capitalism, because these people basically are the violent street fighters for globalism now. They're making war on people that believe in localism. They're allies to big government, and big government's always going to be in bed with big business. I mean, big government doesn't want to deal with loads of little small businesses, and more to the point, big business doesn't want to be dealing with small government. You just get in bed together and you carve things up the way you want to do. So big government, big tech, big business, big media, right? They form one, if you like, conglomerate of an elite that want to just carve things up amongst themselves and leave the rest of us out of it.
And then you have this whole layer of NGOs and state officials who they pretend they're opposed to it, but they actually wouldn't survive without. I don't know a single left-wing activist in Dublin who's not employed by the state. I said to one of them recently, whatever happened to anarchists who used to, shift for themselves, like Bakunin or something. They all work for NGOs and Department of Social Welfare or something.
They're part of the system that they pretend to be opposed to.
Yeah. So Shakespeare and his relationship to Catholicism, is that a significant factor?
Oh, it's crucial. I've written 3 books on the subject. So I wrote a book called The Quest for Shakespeare, The Bard of Avon and the Church of Rome, where I show the biographical and historical evidence for Shakespeare's Catholicism. I also then wrote 2 other books, one called Through Shakespeare's Eyes, Seeing the Catholic Presence in the Plays, where we look at the textual evidence for Shakespeare's Catholicism. Then I wrote a 3rd book called Shakespeare on Love, Discovering the Hidden Meaning of Lord of the Things, and Romeo and Juliet, which is again shows the Catholicism of his approach to that particular play. So there's 2 ways of proving Shakespeare's Catholicism: the biographical approach and the textual approach from the works, and they form a sort of Gothic arch, each supporting the other. And it's basically beyond any reasonable doubt. Obviously, within the context of this interview, I don't have time to give all the evidence for it, but if people want to check out those books, they will find it for themselves. So Shakespeare basically was a Catholic living at a time when it was illegal to be a Catholic. He was someone that was understands, living in a tyranny and he had friends, and I document this, who were martyred for the faith. So Robert Southall, the Jesuit, St. Anne Line, a woman who was hanged for sheltering priests, was certainly known by Shakespeare, and he writes about them in his plays and poems. So, without any reasonable doubt, Shakespeare was a Catholic in times of great persecution of the church.
That's kind of, I suppose, what Chesterton, was kind of recapturing, wasn't it? That his vision or understanding of what England had been centuries before, that he saw linked to, the Church of Rome mainly, but also the fact that the dissolution of the monasteries and the destruction of the commons, that had undermined what had been there's no such thing as a successful economic system, but it wasn't the horror show that Marxist writers would claim, that feudalism was like slavery and it had to be replaced.
Well, it's largely the same thing, because obviously Marxism is an ideology and it's a particular beast, but it's ultimately about secularism. It's ultimately about putting the world and the spirit of the age before God and the Holy Spirit. So Henry VIII was basically a practitioner of big government tyranny. That he did not want to have to be his will to be circumvented by the will of the church. So what he did was create a state religion. and that state religion became compulsory. And if you didn't attend the services of the state religion, you were fined. So there's a tyranny there. The Tudor tyranny is not that different in kind, ultimately. It's a big government imposing secularist values upon a people who don't want it. And in that sense, that Henry VIII has a great deal in common with Marxist regimes and the French Revolution, because they're all about overthrowing the rule of God for the rule of man.
And it's also the destruction of a social order that wasn't just focused on production for its own sake. You needed to produce enough food to feed everybody, and there's always going to be somebody who's going to be a bit better off than everybody else. But that it was part of a broader religious vision which Marxists would explain by saying, yeah, but that was just the feudal lords deluding everybody into.
Well, yeah, but they misunderstand the feudal past, because before Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries were the places where people were educated. They were places that sick went. They were the poorhouses. They basically were the welfare state, if you like, the social institutions which looked after education, health, the poor, were the monasteries. So when Henry VIII destroyed the monasteries, and basically he and his henchmen, the aristocrats who supported him, just took all the monastic lands, they made those into stately homes for themselves. The poor were out on the streets, the monks and the nuns were out on the streets. And then to add insult to injury, they, as you mentioned, they enclosed the common land. Now, the common land in every village was held in common by the village, which means a poor person who has no land or very little land can still own a cow because it could graze on the common land. Once the rich took the common land, then there was nowhere for the poor to own livestock. So they were impoverished and forced into the cities, and then became the proletarianized working class in the Industrial Revolution. So it was this usurpation of the power of the church in the 16th century that paved the way for the penury of the poor and the proletarianization of the majority. So that the whole Marxist understanding of history is skewed and wrong, and because it's there's as Jane Austen reminds us, there's always a correlation between pride and prejudice, and the pride of the Marxists and their anti-Catholicism makes them prejudiced to any ability to see the truth about the past.
So your next project will be?
Well, actually, currently, as regards writing, I'm writing a book which I've called The Good, the Bad, and the Beautiful, History in Three Dimensions. And what I want to do in that is to show the truth of Pope Benedict. As Pope Benedict said, that in the end, the only defense for the church are the saints that she's produced and the great art that she's inspired. So I want to show that there are basically three threads that run through all of history from the time of Christ. The thread of goodness, the thread of sanctity, those who lay down their lives for others, and then the bad, the wickedness of the worldly, those who refuse to lay down their life for others, but indeed insist on laying down the lives of others for themselves. You either sacrifice yourself for others or you sacrifice others for the self. That's as simple as that. So the good, the bad, and then the great works of beauty in terms of art, architecture, music, literature, that have been inspired by Christianity since the time of Christ. So those three threads showing a tapestry. And one reason I want to do that is we are prone to think that, to fall into the progressive trap and the progressive lie, that we're moving forward from a barbaric past to a golden age in the future where we won't need religion. We will jettison all that and we'll all be happy because we're secular. Now, the history doesn't show that. The 20th century was the bloodiest history in human history, and arguably the most godless. So we're certainly not moving forward in any meaningful progressive sense. So this book is meant to show that fabric, that tapestry that weaves its way through all the centuries and will continue until the final curtain falls, whenever that might be.
I think actually Solzhenitsyn said that one time, that there may be material progress, but if human nature changes, it only changes at geological pace. They were basically the same as we were when we had carts, horses and carts, that human morals, the capacity of humans for good and evil hasn't changed at all. And that the great fallacy is that if you improve people's material conditions, you de facto improve that you're going to create this socialist man, the new man, or the Aryan master race, and it's.
Yeah, absolutely. Solzhenitsyn, as usually, is right. I mean, the 7 deadly sins are still sins, and they're still deadly. The virtues are still virtuous, and it's the virtues only, which is basically love in action, that brings harmony to human society. The absence of that love brings hatred and division. And the only thing about material progress, first of all, that it's true that comfort is the great corrupter, and that becoming more comfortable does not make you better, it's likely to make you worse. But also that the technological progress means that the same sinful man now has weapons at his disposal to do much more harm than primitive man ever had. So what you're doing is like putting a submachine gun in the hands of a 7-year-old. It's actually perilous. So I think it's naive to the point of absurdity to think that material or technological progress is going to deliver happiness and harmony.
Well, it obviously hasn't.
Hasn't, and it won't.
And that's the whole. Remember when the great debate within Irish nationalism used to be when it became more left-wing, said the older traditional view was based on rerum novarum and distributivism, basically. And I was very opposed to welfareism. And I could never get my head around that because it's you associate that with, say, Thatcherism, saying, oh, we're going to cut you off the labour and you won't get health benefits and stuff like that. And they said, no. I remember talking to some of the older people who had written these documents in the 50s and 60s. They said, no, it's nothing to do with that. It's about not turning people into the kind of state dependence that Belloc described in the servile state. It took me a long time to understand that, because you can think yourself into a situation where you can regard yourself as, somebody else is going to do this for me, rather than, no, it's actually, I've created this mess, or I can make it better, or I can help somebody else. And it's a completely different view of the world. And I've got to states where people I would have been formerly friendly with and politically close to can no longer understand them. And it's kind of resonated with me when you were talking about your old, like Nick Griffin and other people who you were involved with in the National Front, that it does come a stage where you may still like them and you may have fond memories of them, but it's a completely different, incompatible view of the world.
Yeah, I agree completely. The only thing I would say, and I think this is something you have to remember, C.K. Chesterton said in his autobiography of his relationship with his brother, that we were always arguing, but we never quarreled. In other words, that a quarrel, if you like, is about just beating the other person, and it's not really about learning to be closer to the truth. Whereas an argument is having an exchange with another person, so the idea being that both of you at the end of it are closer to whatever is true. So even if at the end of it you still agree to differ, and at the very least, you know more about the other person's position, the other person's perspective. And that in itself is good. If both of you know more about the other person and where they're coming from, you won't be attacking them from a position of ignorance and arrogance, but from a position of knowledge. Obviously, all has to be made new in love. And I think the difference between an argument and a quarrel is an argument is basically animated by love for the other, the desire that the other should know the truth. And indeed, a desire that I should know the truth better and I might learn from the other, versus a quarrel, whereas you're the enemy and I have to destroy you at all costs because you're in the way of what I want and what I think is right and what I think is best. And that, of course, leads to us killing each other, hating each other. And it's the politics of division and the politics of hatred. And we have to avoid that at all costs. But we do have to be prepared to talk to people who are political enemies. Because that's the way forward.
I also have to avoid thinking that you're superior to other people, even though you might think or even know they're wrong. But I find that's the most kind of, to me, saddening part of the stage of life I'm at, is that I meet people who I was very close to for a long, long time. And even talking to them about sports or music things that we would have in common outside of politics, that they seem to be incapable of setting that aside. If you could be talking about you could be talking about the World Cup or the European Cup, and they bring some extraneous issue in to box you into the corner. And America seems to be even worse in that everything has become politicized and ideology.
Well, I think the irony is, Matt, that that relativism leads to tyranny because your beliefs become personal, right? You're not subjecting yourself to a truth that's above and beyond you, to which basically you're a servant, but your truth is something which is yours, that you own, and if someone disagrees with you, it's seen as a personal affront, a personal attack, which makes it impossible to talk about anything, because as soon as you say something that somebody else disagrees with, they take it personally. So that's the end of all intellectual, all honest pursuit of reality. When you daren't say something to somebody, because if they disagree with me, they're going to think I'm attacking them personally, which you're not doing. Again, the difference between an argument and a quarrel.
John Wayne had gone to Berkeley University, I think it was Berkeley or Stanford, and he was confronted by this mob who hated him, because of the Vietnam War, and Wayne supported Reagan and he was Republican. And I watched it then again. I just came across it by accident on YouTube recently, so it's a completely different view. At the time I said, well, it's all on the side of the students, but the thing that struck me was, first of all, Wayne was very humorous, but also he won the audience over, not to his view, but they no longer wanted to beat him to death. They were laughing, and they were speaking, well, I disagree with John over the war, we should leave Vietnam, but they ended up engaging with each other and understanding that would be impossible. You can imagine James Wood going to Berkeley now, they wouldn't let him for the start.
Well, there is my wife from Southern California, we sometimes fly into Santa Ana Airport, which is called John Wayne Airport. And there's a big statue of John Wayne, dressed as a cowboy. And I'm wondering how long before that particular statue is also topped. It's probably its days are maybe numbered, which says something about the times in which we live. I would say something, Matt, though, with you and I, with our respective backgrounds, that for me a very, very important thing is, if I find myself feeling angry, I walk away. Because I don't think any of us, I think the only place we should not follow in the footsteps of Jesus Christ is when he turns over the tables of the temple. Because if we pursue Christ with a spirit of righteous anger, very quickly we lose charity. And if we lose charity, we're on the losing side. We're fighting for the wrong side the moment we lose charity. So whenever I see myself feeling angry about something, first of all, I pray. But if I can't actually engage with it without feeling angry, I go somewhere else. As
the kind of trendy saying is, you're allowing them to live rent-free in your head if you... Yeah, and they're actually converting,
because even if you hate their ideas, if you're as angry as they are, you've joined the enemy.
Yeah, indeed. Well, it's been fascinating talking to you, and I hope the audience enjoyed it, and best of luck in your future endeavours.